Welcome everyone to this evening's event. We're very excited for it. We have Doctors Kina with us tonight, and I'm really excited to have this interview. This is Rasha Christie's YouTube channel, and we've been doing this since the lockdown to still try and get discussions going. And we're a ministry that focuses on university students and high school students, trying to train and equip them to be able to answer any objections to the Christian faith. And we are, so as I said tonight, we are interviewing Doctors Kina, and I'm the chapter director at a local university here in KwaZulu-Natal. And a lot of the students that come to our meetings are African, and they have a lot of questions and challenges that are posed to them in terms of Christianity being a white man's religion. And so we're going to be talking about this book tonight, and I read it, and it was really interesting and really challenging as well. But I'm really excited about the discussion that we're going to have tonight. And a lot of the questions when we're talking at our chapter meetings, a lot of the questions that are posed are on the things like, Christianity is a white man's religion. So how can we trust what the Bible says if it was written by white people? And the missionaries came with the gospel and they taught us to pray. And when we opened our eyes, they handed us the Bible, but they took our land. And these are the kind of objections and challenges that the students face when they're interacting with their classmates. And so I wanted to maybe we can just begin in your book that you co-wrote. You share a bit of your journey as a white male trying to deal with racial tension. And maybe you can just start off for the listeners tonight. You can start off with a bit of your testimony and your journey through this challenging topic.
Sure. My best friend in high school was African American, but we didn't really talk about racial issues. They were part of our environment, but I guess, somehow we didn't think about that in the context of our friendship, because we both become Christians about the same time. So we visited each other's churches, but there were sociological reasons why his church was largely black and my church was largely white. Now, this is a problem. I mean, it's Southern Africa and the U.S. especially. It's not a global, ethnocentrism is a global issue, but, particularly in terms of colors, that's, our cultures have had particular problems with this, and the problems have been from the white side, at least initially. So because of colonialism and so on. But in any case, over the years, I began to realize more, but, I thought that the civil rights movement in the US had taken care of racism. And then when I was going through the deepest crisis in my life, there was an African-American family, really a grandmother raising her 5 grandchildren by herself. And they kind of took me in as a kind of an honorary member of the family. And they would take me to church with them, and their church knew how to deal with pain because they'd been dealing with it for centuries. And as I was listening to them, and also I was working on my PhD, I was at Duke University at the time in Durham in the US, and listening to my African-American friends talk around me, like not trying to persuade me of something, but just saying the incidents that had happened to them on a day-by-day basis, I began to realize the civil rights movement hadn't taken care of all this stuff, that it was really a live issue. And in the context I was in, I mean, there again, ethnic issues are a lot bigger than just black and white. In the context I was in, it was, black and white. And I said, wait a minute. Well, if the white people have been doing this to the black people haven't been doing this to the white people, So in this context, the side that's the right side, the just side, would be the black side. And if I'm God's servant, then I need to be on the black side. And so you can tell by looking at me, I didn't exactly become black, but I ended up in an African American church, serving there under an African American pastor. That was the beginning of my part of that. Lived in an African American neighborhood full time, and then I taught in an African American school. But eventually, I ended up not marrying an African American. But would you like Medine to tell some of her story?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Well, I just want to say that I did not write the book. I did not co-write the book with Craig.
A different book.
So
we did a different book on ethnic reconciliation.
Craig will be answering all the questions on this book. I grew up in Congo. And in Congo, the issue was not race, is not race. The issue is ethnicity. Or the issue is regions, which part of the country you are from. And we have experienced social troubles, war, and so on because of some of the issues that I see in the US. I mean, people are afraid of somebody who doesn't look like them, or people do not want to associate to someone who doesn't look like them. And so because of those tensions between ethnic groups, we experienced the wars and tribalism. But I grew up in a setting where my house was open to everyone. My father was, he was changed as a child of God, and he was open. He did not he did not let us experience the class differences or the ethnic differences, or anyone, whatever your social standing, whatever your ethnic background, whatever the color of your skin. We had white, blacks, everyone ate at our table. So when I grew up, I did not experience the tensions. But then later on in my life, I could see the differences as I grew up. And I could see that people fought along ethnic lines, things that at first I didn't understand why we were fighting. But then later on, I started to understand why we had all these differences. So yeah, that's it.
And she was a refugee for 18 months during the ethnic war, one of the ethnic wars in her country. So ethnic reconciliation is a big issue for Medine as well.
It is.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I know that the book is is based on African American. That's what's behind it. But in South Africa, we've also had a troubled past, and especially along race lines and things like that. And so I think there's a lot to offer, even though it's from an African American perspective. I think there's a lot to offer for us as well here in South Africa. And I was wondering, I know that this book was published, I think about 25 years ago, if I remember correctly. And how was it first received? Because it's quite a bold title. How was it first received?
Well, Medine and I co-authored a little booklet on ethnic reconciliation that's free, but this other one was co-authored by me and an African American pastor, and it was received pretty well. I mean, especially Glenn, he knew the issues pretty well that were live issues. I was teaching at an African American seminary and college at the time, so I was in touch with the students and the issues there. So it made a good difference. One of the points of criticism we got was because it was called Black Man's Religion. It was really a response to people that said white man's religion. But some of our African American women friends were upset that we said Black man's religion instead of Black people's religion. And I understand, but we were trying to play on the name the other people were giving it white man's religion. We thought if we didn't use that phrase, anyway. So in the sequel to the book, we apologized and said, here's what we meant by it. But anyway.
And do you feel that or have you noticed any changes in questions in the past 25 years? Because I remember, I think in the beginning of the book, you wrote about the questions that young people were asking. Have you noticed changes in those questions?
Yeah, there are some changes now. I'm less of an expert on it now because, well, most of the past couple decades I've been immersed in writing scholarly books on the New Testament. So I haven't been as in touch with it, but on the street, it seems like some of the discourse has moved from the alternative being Islam to the alternative being something called Hebrew Israelites. So there's been a shift in some of the alternatives, but the issue about people saying Christianity is a white religion is still keenly felt in some circles. And it's really sad. I mean, it's because of white racism that idea is there. So it's a response to white racism. But historically, Christianity wasn't just a white religion. In fact, it didn't start in Europe. It didn't start among what we might call white people. I mean, in the U.S., probably a lot of Israelites would have had to sat in the back of the bus. In the South, where there were segregation by color, in South Africa, maybe they would have been in the colored category. If I don't know South African terminology too much, but not just black, not just white, but anyway, that's another story. So,
thank you. So what I really found fascinating was the history, the rich history of Christianity in Africa, and just reading through, not even just Christianity, but just reading through. You mentioned a few of the empires, the ancient empires in Africa, and all those kind of things. But what I wanted to know, you quote from a 19th century European scholar who acknowledged that through Africa, Christianity became the religion of the world. Could you maybe briefly talk about that? Just expand on that a bit.
Sure. The first Gentile Christian was not from Europe. The first non-Jewish Christian was from Africa. In Acts chapter 8, verses 27 to 40, we have somebody he's called a eunuch 5 times. So it's like Luke is trying to reinforce that point that he's an official of the queen. Officials of queens in many cultures in antiquity were eunuchs for reasons that would appeal to the king. But eunuchs, according to Deuteronomy 23:3, they or maybe verse 2, they couldn't become officially part of Israel. They couldn't be circumcised. So here's somebody who's a God-fearer. He worships the true God, but he's not able to become a full Israelite. He's closer than Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. He's not as close as the proselyte from Antioch in Syria in Acts chapter 6, but he's a fully Gentile person. He becomes the first Christian. He was from the Empire of Meroe. We know that because the queen's title there is the Kandaka. It's stated in Acts 8:27. So what that means is that he was from a kingdom that everybody acknowledged to be a Black African kingdom. He's the first Gentile convert. He's the beginning of where it all went after that. Now, besides that, you have in the leadership team in the church in Antioch, which was really the cosmopolitan, multicultural church from which the good news about Jesus spread to the rest of the Roman Empire. in Acts 13, the leadership team, they seem to be all Jewish in background, but in terms of what they're, whether any of them had been proselytes in their background, at least we know that one of them was of dark complexion. One of them was from North Africa. Simeon, called Niger, it was a common Roman name, but when it was used as a nickname, like Simeon called something, then it meant the person was dark. And the other one, Lucius of Cyrene, of course, Cyrene is in North Africa. It was multi-ethnic, but the location was in North Africa. And then the gospel, it's going to other places, but it doesn't enter Europe until Acts chapter 16. And it might even be seen as a reversal of the Greeks and Romans spoke of the Trojan War and Alexander the Great and so on as Europeans making conquests in Asia. But here the gospel is going from what by Greek and Roman standards were Asia into Europe. And the Greeks are the ones who came up with these continental divisions about what's Europe, what's Asia, and what's Africa. So these are kind of arbitrary divisions. But by those divisions, Israel, it was never in Europe. It was in Asia, directly adjoining Africa, part of an Afro-Asiatic continuum of cultures. So it was always in touch with that. In the Old Testament, you have not just Egyptians, but you have Nubians from the area around what became Meroe later, great Nubian Empire from like 3000 BC. Meroe had been an empire from around 750 BC. But anyway, getting back to your more directly to your question, most of the major, most of the major theologians of the early centuries came from North Africa. The persecution in Rome was pretty strong. It was hard for theologians to gain voices there. But you have Cyprian of Carthage, you have the Alexandrian theologians. Origen isn't exactly my favorite, but you also have Athanasius, a leading defender of the Trinity. Athanasius was called by his enemies the Black Dwarf, which presumably means he was short, but also presumably means he was dark in complexion, even by Egyptian standards. You also have Tertullian, who was the one who coined the term Trinity, who was late 2nd, early 3rd century theologian. He was from North Africa. Augustine, he was a mixed race, but he was from North Africa. His father was Latin from I guess he had come from Rome, a settler from Rome, or maybe he became a Roman citizen another way. I don't know. But his mother was definitely a local Berber. So Augustine is North African. So that the church has a great African heritage, and without the African contributions, the church wouldn't be what it is. And through most of history, I mean, around the year 333, the exact year is debated, but somewhere around the year 333, while Rome was opening up to the gospel, before the Roman Empire officially became Christian, the East African kingdom of Aksum, under the Emperor Izanus, became Christian. And Ethiopia has remained a Christian presence to this day. Now, missionaries could have come from Ethiopia. I mean, the fact that a lot of the missionaries came from Europe and from the US, and a lot of the missionaries were white, we might call it an accident of history or whatever. Ethiopia was Christian before Northern Europe heard the gospel. Ethiopia was Christian before people brought the gospel to the continent in which I live, and was a leading defender of Christianity in Europe. Sorry, in Egypt. Both begin with E. In Egypt and elsewhere. Nubia also had remained largely Christian for about 1,000 years. So major African empires, and they were known about in Europe as well, that had become Christian at that point. And that story hasn't always been told by those who tell church history from a Eurocentric perspective. You know, they were telling it from the perspective of their own culture, but I mean, that's all clearly recorded in the documents. And the people who first brought the gospel to Ethiopia, by the way, to the kingdom of Aksum, were from Syria. They weren't from Europe. So the gospel in Africa definitely did not start with Europeans.
Sure. That's really fascinating, and I think that really gets lost when we talk about Christianity. You know, that rich history that it has in Africa, and I don't know if you know this, but is there like how far south? You know, because we're in southern Africa. I mean, how far south would the gospel have traveled in those early days? I don't know if there's any way of knowing that.
Well, the African court official from Acts chapter 8, if he was from Meroe, that was like closer to the source of the Nile. So I'm not even sure about how far south in Africa people lived at that point, or where they all lived. That's not my expertise. But there were trade ties that can suggest that those who were Christians may have carried the gospel with them. We know that there were trade ties as far south as Tanzania, at least. There was a bust of Caesar found as far south as Tanzania. Roman trading ships in the 2nd century reached as far as Vietnam. We have records of that. And they, you know, there were trade ties with China and so on. There weren't trade ties with our continent over here yet. But but what you have in Revelation, which makes me feel good living in a continent that probably most people didn't know about in the 1st century, it says that people from every kindred and tribe and people and nation, every language, are gathered before God's throne. In Revelation 5:9 and Revelation 7:9. And so, you know, even the ones that they couldn't have imagined in the 1st century. And of course, in the 1st century, it's 1/10 of 1% of the Roman Empire had become Christian, max. You know, so even in the Roman Empire, it was very small. And the Roman Empire, by the way, wasn't just a European kingdom. By the Greek division of continents, Rome was in Italy, which was in Europe. But if you look at maps of the Roman Empire, it's as much a North African kingdom as it is a Southern European one, and a Western Asian one. But the gospel was also spreading further to the east. But the records are very limited after 2,000 years. So we can only speculate and say, well, there were contacts here. The gospel may have gone, you know, as far as people went, but we don't have records in most cases.
Thank you. My next question is, so a lot of the talk in South Africa that I'm aware of anyway is about how, you know, Christianity is a white man's religion, as we've, you know, said, but also about the colonialists and, you know, what they've done in Africa. But in reading the history in this book, it talks about the history of the Islamic conquest of Africa. And I just wanted to ask, why do you think that there's not a lot of talk about that and more about the white colonialists?
Do you want to?
No.
Did you hear my question?
Yeah. There may be more talk about the white colonialists because a lot of the places that have been colonized previously, colonized, conquered, whatever, subdued by European civilizations have gained freedom, whereas a lot of the places that were subdued by Islam are still under Islamic control. That's a guess. But in terms of the slave trade, as far back as the 900s, you have race being used as a justification in Islam for slavery. Now, I do want to say, this is not from Muhammad. It's not in the Quran. It doesn't treat race that way. Muhammad did hold slaves, so obviously he wasn't against slavery. But it wasn't until a few centuries later that some Muslims came up with an idea about the curse of Ham. Now, of course, Genesis 9 doesn't speak of a curse of Ham. It speaks of a curse on Canaan, which gets fulfilled when the Israelites go in and conquer the land of Canaan. Now, that story has been abused and exploited by colonialists, but that was a once in history thing for people who were killing their babies and stuff like that. It was anyway. There's a whole long explanation for why that was, but it was like once in history. It was not approved of for after that. But when the Muslims in North Africa were talking about the curse of Ham, they said, well, it means we can enslave Black people, and it was a way of getting around. Well, what if they're already Muslim? Well, we can enslave Black people. So, but Islamic racism and Islamic slavery was different from slavery, say, in the United States, because they often would marry or have concubines across races. In the US, it happened, but it was unofficial because it was officially illegal to have sex with your slaves, to sexually harass them and so on. So, there was more, and Portuguese also were more open to it than British were. So, like, there were different cultures in terms of colonialism. It was carried out in different ways. But yeah, and also the some of the colonial past is more present to us than others. There was a certain era where probably Arab Islamic colonialism was more dominant than others in Africa. The Europeans were kind of late getting involved in the African slave trade. Arabs have been doing it for a long time. In fact, before Muhammad's time, the Persians had been doing it. So the Sasanian slave trade. But then Europeans made up for lost time once they got involved, and the transatlantic slave trade, maybe 1/3 of the slaves died in transit. So it was an awful thing. And during the 19th century, Britain became the dominant colonial power. So they're having power in India. They're having power in a lot of Africa. France having power in a lot of Africa. And I think, therefore, it's a more recent memory. And a lot of places that have gotten free from colonialism have gotten free from British colonialism more recently. But historically, it wasn't just British. But we can joke, if Britain and France are playing soccer, that we each root for our former colonial power. But anyway.
So the next thing I want.
We're not able to hear you, just yet.
There was an interesting example in the book of a man. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There was an interesting example of a man in Los Angeles ghetto who could not get a job, and he was complaining that white people were keeping him down, but he managed to finish school and move up economically. But then he complained about how black people are so lazy in the ghetto and they don't want to work and that kind of thing. And the point that is made from this example was that economics alone is not the answer to help with racial tension. It's a heart issue. And, the problem is the universal human problem of selfishness and exploiting power whenever, no matter who gets it, it seems to be exploited. And we've seen that here in South Africa, since our democracy and the ANC government has taken over, it still seems that the people who need it the most are still being exploited. How do we deal with this? I know this is quite a huge question, but how do we deal with this?
Well, the gospel transforms human hearts. Although, given the things we've been talking about, it's also obvious when people talked about the gospel but didn't let it transform their hearts. Because, like people say, power corrupts, or the Talmud says power buries those who wield it. Sin, it's not just a skin problem, it's a sin problem. It goes deeper. Selfishness, when taken to a corporate level, is my group versus your group. So when my group gets power, we can exploit it unless we follow a different leadership model that Jesus offers us. For instance, in Mark chapter 10, when the disciples, you're reading through Mark and hear the people with power in society, they object when Jesus is going to the marginalized, he's going to the poor, he's going to the sick and healing them. The people with power, they don't want to give it up, the priestly aristocracy. And then the disciples in Mark chapter 10, they start acting like these other people. I mean, they were nobodies when Jesus called them, but now they're like, well, which of us will be greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus has to sit them down and say, look, the greatest is the servant. And if you really want to be great in the kingdom, seek to serve. And then he gives himself as an example, even the Son of Man. This Son of Man that Daniel 7 says is going to reign over the nations. The Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for the many. So we follow Jesus' example. We're gonna seek to serve. And that's a transformation that sometimes we haven't seen in places that claim to be Christian, but not because the gospel has failed, but because the gospel hasn't been applied, really. So we need to, when I was an atheist, I said, Christianity can't be right. Look at all these people who claim to be Christian. They don't live like it makes a difference to them. And I was throwing in the real Christians with the nominal Christians. I mean, there were, I wasn't distinguishing. So I saw a lot of nominal Christianity, but I said, if I ever believed there was a God, it would only make sense to give God everything. Eventually, I found out that the truth of the gospel doesn't rise or fall on the people who claim to be Christian when it's convenient to make that claim. The gospel rises or falls on Jesus Christ. And recognizing that Jesus is who he says he is, I became a follower of Jesus and determined that even if there was no other real Christianity, then if Jesus is really Lord, I'm going to follow him and I'm going to be a real Christian. And of course, I found out that I wasn't by any means the only one. There were lots of real Christians, but the gospel has power to transform, to take us beyond selfishness, to care for other people. And Nadine, you can give examples of ethnic reconciliation in Congo or wherever.
I just want to say that economics are important.
Yes.
In that when you find yourself poor, you don't have a voice. As a war refugee, everything that I needed was just to get something and eat and be able to go on. And so for those who have power, it's very important to share that power and make sure that they also cater to the ones who are poor, the ones who cannot help themselves. Yes, God changes our hearts and we serve him, but also we need to remember our brothers and sisters and come alongside them, help them to get from where they are to a better place.
Yeah. And I guess what I was saying was the people in power need to do the serving. The people who are not in power already, they already understand that it's not just those who are in power who are right. Yeah.
Thank you. There was a part that really challenged me, and it says, reconciliation demands a commitment to work through differences and stand for justice, even when it is costly to one or both parties. As one writer admits, white guilt is merely self-indulgent exercise that profits no one. The real issue is not whether one is concerned about combating racism, but whether one is actually doing anything to combat it. And that was really challenging because, we can so often talk about these things, but, when it comes down to the wire and actually, especially if it's going to cost you, then it doesn't seem that we go that extra step. And I suppose my question then is how do you see true reconciliation happening?
I don't know. I mean, just like it says, our words need to be backed up with our actions. And yes, it is costly. It calls for humility and listening and understanding. Jesus taught me that during war when I found myself in front of a woman from the north of Congo, in Congo, Brazzaville. The north and the south was going through war, and this lady found herself in the wrong part of the country. She was from the north, and when she ran away to find safety, she was in the south, and so ran with people from the south. And the lady came to me and needed something to eat. Life was hard. We did not have enough to eat. And but Jesus helped me to see the lady, like ask myself questions. Look at this woman. She is Congolese. I am Congolese. She's a mother. I was a mother. She's in rags. I didn't have good clothes on. She was emaciated. I was emaciated. I mean, it just basically the Lord told me there is no difference between you and this lady. If I love her, then I'm asking you to love her and to share what you have with her. And so I did. I went the extra mile. And I think that reconciliation, if we sit in our, lawns or chairs and talk, it's not enough. And it will cost us.
Loving your neighbor as yourself means, as Medine was just saying, putting yourself in their place, thinking about what it would be like to be them. And we need to listen, swift to hear, slow to speak. We need to hear where other people are coming from their mouth. Doesn't mean we always have to agree with everything, but we need to hear people out. We need to hear their experience and not jump to conclusions that we know what everybody's going through. A dominant culture can be blind to the minority cultures within it. The minority cultures have to know the dominant culture. So here in the US, white people can act like, well, I've never seen racism. Well, maybe they wouldn't see it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It's the same with, miracles. Some people say, miracles, I've never seen one. Well, that doesn't mean they're not happening just because you haven't seen one. I mean, if other people have seen them, if you have credible eyewitnesses. So we need to listen. And reconciliation is not optional. It's not something just adjacent to the gospel. If we really believe the gospel, then we need to bend over backwards to listen to one another, to serve one another. Besides all the stuff it says about serving one another, in the New Testament, the big ethnic issue in the earliest church was between Jew and Gentile. It's all over the place in the New Testament. It's in Matthew, it's in Acts, it's in Romans, Galatians, Ephesians. It's a big, huge issue. Jewish Samaritan also. Paul gives an example with Scythians also. Scythians, no, they were white people. In Colossians 3:11, probably area of Russia, they're southern Russia maybe. But anyway, Paul emphasizes this, how we become one body in Christ, and that unity in Christ, it transcends differences of Jew and Gentile, social status, transcends differences of gender. Obviously, we still have different genders. I'm glad for that. we still have our different cultures, but we all come to God on the same terms through Jesus Christ. And in Acts chapter 21, where Paul he's been falsely accused of having brought a Gentile into the temple. And so he appeals to the crowd in the local language. He builds a lot of rapport with them. He shares a lot of their experiences. He lived in Jerusalem, they live in Jerusalem, and so on. But then finally he gets to the part about, and the Lord sent me to the Gentiles, and the riot starts up again, because that was the whole issue. Gentiles have been really mean to Jerusalem in recent years. And yet for Paul, he couldn't preach the gospel and leave this out. Because if you're really going to be a follower of Jesus, you have to love whoever's going to be your brother and sister in Jesus. That's a non-negotiable. Now, hopefully your brother and sister in Jesus is going to behave like a brother and sister in Jesus, but we have to behave like brothers and sisters in Jesus and work to build those relationships.
Sure. Thank you. I was going to ask another question, but you've kind of answered that question as well in all of that. Thank you very much. And then I just want to maybe end off my questions, and then we've got a few questions from the audience coming through to help the students that are in my chapter. How would you answer the objection that the Bible can't be trusted because it was written by white people? Maybe if you could give a few pointers to help with that.
Well, yeah, how can we trust the Bible even though it was written by white people? Well, first of all, it wasn't written by white people. If we're thinking of white in terms of European cultures, possibly Luke was a Greek, but everybody else was Jewish. Now, as to whether Jewish counts as white or not, it wasn't European. It was Western Asia, on the border of Africa. So in terms of continental divisions, in terms of color divisions, the Jewish people had mixed ancestry as well. I mean, Abraham was from further to the east in Mesopotamia. There was intermarriage among the Israelites when they were in Egypt with local people, but also and also with those who had been their servants, who would be like Hagar and others who were Egyptians, whom Pharaoh gave to Abraham. So all of them reduced to servitude. They would have intermarried. Also, we have in the mother of two of the tribes in Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh, was Egyptian. So just right off the bat, I mean, we're not speaking of, and none of them were European. Of course, if you go back far enough, now this may have changed. I'm not up on genetics, but the last I read on genetics, they said that white people are made of 65% Asian and 35% African genes. So you go back far enough, there weren't any, Europeans. But anyway, but having said all that, the issue isn't through whom God sent the Bible. He sent it through a particular culture in a particular place because God cares about us in our historical particularity. It wasn't just, some ethereal, non-cultural, accultural thing. Came in a particular cultural setting. Some of it happened in Egypt. A lot of the Old Testament happened in Egypt. It was a place of oppression at one point, but it was also a place where God exalted Joseph, and it was a place of refuge later on in Israel's history, sometimes for prophets, place of refuge for Jesus, probably in the large Jewish community there in Alexandria. But ultimately, the Bible is a message from God. It's given through a cultural framework. Every culture today, we have to recontextualize it. Even Jewish people today, have to recontextualize it for a new setting. But the message is not from a God who's white or a God who's black, but a God who made all humans in his image. And so we're talking about the God of heaven, not the God of this culture or that culture. And, it started in the Middle East, but it's for all people.
That's good.
Our PhDs are in different disciplines, and so
this is your discipline.
So if we some other conversation, Medine may be the one talking, I may be the one. That sounds good.
So I have a couple of questions from Simon. He asks, are you familiar with Odin's work on how Africans shape the Christian mind? What contributions did the African church make to church history? Which I think we've touched on a little bit, but are you familiar with Odin's work?
Yes, yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah, some of the traditions are later, but yeah, like we said, a lot of the earliest theologians for the church who shaped the theology that the church has carried on for centuries since then. They were from Africa. Now, in North Africa, you have a mixture of different cultures. And in Egypt, for example, you have a range of complexions, but they included, like Athanasius was clearly black. You have an early African bishop who made it to Rome. What was his name? It's been too many years. Eodexus or something. It's not. I don't have it just right, but there was a mural painted of him, and he was clearly black. So, and of course, by the standards of people to the north, all the Egyptians were called black. So, it depends on what culture, what you use. Like people like me from Mediterranean world, the average writer in the Mediterranean world, or like Aristotle, he spoke of people to the south. He said they're very dark, including Egyptians. He said they're black, and it's because the sun has cooked them. And people to the north, people who look more like me, they're white and their skin is frozen. But we're in between. We're the normal people, Aristotle said. and Arabs later said we're the normal people. People of the north, people of the south, they're different. And so pretty much everybody defines themselves as in the middle. But yeah, I'm diverging some from your question because part of it we already said. But you could talk about the church history in Congo, like 1400s and so on, if you want.
I don't have anything off of my head right now that brought a contribution to the world. Those I know are people who fought for the Africans, for independence and things like that.
Yeah, and there were places that would have made greater contributions, except colonialists suppressed them. You had a number of African prophets in the early 20th century. well, I mean, people may differ on how they define that, but anyway, indigenous African Christian movements that were suppressed by colonial powers. So in Congo Kinshasa, you have Simon Kimbangu. By most of our theological standards today, most of us wouldn't agree with where the movement went. But when it started, I mean, it went off because Simon Kimbangu was imprisoned by the colonial authorities, no longer speaking into the movement. You also have Prophet Braid in West Africa. He prophesied in the name of the God of Israel, called for rain to fall, rain fell. I mean, you have Prophet Harris, who went into what's now Cote d'Ivoire, basically established the Methodist churches there. He said, my gift isn't teaching, but he had a gift of evangelism. People were being healed, thousands and thousands being converted. But all these movements were suppressed by the colonial authorities. So you already had indigenous African movements that were Christian, that were contributing to the spread of the gospel, but were suppressed. And they were suppressed by colonialists.
Sure. And then another question, which is, I think, what is coming through America now is, what do you think of critical theory and the cultural Marxism, which is shaping the debate on racism?
Well, this is more recent than my work, but sometimes when we impose an external grid on things, we're not interpreting them from the ground up. We're not interpreting them inductively. And some grids work better than others, but Marxism is not an African approach. It's not an Asian approach. And certainly Marxist atheism, which I don't think is part of that package, but that was a European product, which I know China is not part of our discussion right now, but it always surprises me that, I mean, atheism was not a Chinese invention. And so for the Chinese government to say, no, you need to be atheist to be a good Marxist, well, that's kind of intellectual imperialism from the West, something imported from the West. But we need to be careful when we put grids on things. At the same time, people look for alternatives to systems that have been used to hold people down. And so, at least if we can speak of alternatives, we can say, okay, there's more than one way to look at things. And so let's say, let's be eclectic and take the best of everything. But Marxism doesn't have the best track record in the past century in terms of genocide and other things. But then Western colonialism has a pretty bad track record too, certainly in the DRC, Congo. Was particularly horrible, but it's been horrible pretty much everywhere. Mm-hmm. You want to say anything about your any of your professors in what you studied?
No.
All right.
Another question that came through is, as part of a global decolonization movement, there is a push to get rid of so-called Western literature, of which Augustine's writings are seminal. Should that perhaps get a rethink?
Well, yeah, I mean, Augustine was from North Africa. So just because the West adopted stuff from there, that doesn't mean we should throw it out. Yeah.
Then there was a comment made, this has been very insightful, thanks, Dr. Kina. I would like to know how you met I would like to know how you met your wife.
Oh.
So now I can hand that over to you.
No. Well, we met. We met at Duke University. I was an exchange student, and Craig was doing his PhD. So I came here to finish with my PhD. That's when I met Craig.
Yeah, she was doing her PhD dissertation on African American women after the period of Reconstruction. So she came to study Americans, and she got one. But then we met through in the U.S. It's called InterVarsity, GBU in Francophone countries, part of International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and so kind of, it was before the days of Ratio Christi, but campus ministry, yeah, and so we really liked each other, but we were both very shy. I don't seem shy right now because I'm talking about stuff related to my discipline, but we were both shy. So even though we really liked each other, it really took us 11 more years to get married. But she went back to France, finished her PhD, then returned to Congo when she was caught up in the war there. And we, during the 18 months that she was a refugee, we had no contact. And I was panicking because the last letter I got from her said, I don't know if I'm going to live or die. And her cousin had just been shot dead. Her brother and father had nearly been shot dead. And so, meanwhile, she was traveling through snake-infested swamps and fields of army ants and so on, trying to get food for her parents and siblings, and just awful conditions. I was thinking, I need to go to Congo and look for my friend, but my French isn't very good, and I don't know any Munukatuba, Kitsangi, or Lingala. And so my Francophone African friend said, you're just going to get yourself killed. So anyway, but after 18 months, I get a letter from her. She found my address.
And then we were connected, and here we are.
Okay, that's a short version. We have another book. We're called Impossible Love. It tells our story. Yeah. I don't know if this is going to be backwards on the screen, or yeah, it's backwards on the screen. I guess we could flip it. But anyway, it's a short book. It has no footnotes. It's not like most of my books.
Thank you. Another question is there a difference between racism and tribalism?
I don't think there is a difference. I mean, the concept is the same, is not liking or hating somebody because they do not look like you. So racism, it's a question of you white, black, Asian, and so on. But tribalism is, well, you're from the north of Congo, maybe you have some facial things, or you're from the south of Congo. In its heart, it's the same thing. It's ethnic discrimination. That's what I think.
Yeah. In the history of particular places, ethnocentrism became racism to justify slavery, to justify economic oppression, to justify apartheid or whatever. But the transcultural human principle behind it is ethnocentrism. And so putting it in those terms, when for me, when I became part of the African American community, I saw things in black and white terms, which wasn't really fair to immigrants from Latin America or other places who, there were also issues that they were struggling with discrimination. But in the community where I lived, it was mainly black and white, and that was a real issue. But when I started spending time in Africa, most of it was in Nigeria at the beginning, and saw, the tensions from Yoruba and Igbo and people from the north who spoke Hausa and other groups, and people from one group, I was still single, they'd say, oh, don't marry somebody from this tribe because they'll they said all the Burms are drunks. But my friend, his wife was Burm. He said, no, the Burm, they're the best. You should marry a Burm. Don't marry somebody from this other tribe. They'll dominate you. So anyway, but I got the best. Anyway, that was a subjective statement. But.
Thank you. The next question.
Solomon 1:5, black and beautiful.
The next question is, could you expand a bit on the existence of major African empires that are mentioned in the book? And then what are some suggested resources which one could do further study on these empires?
You can supplement me here, because it's been years since I did the research for the book. But the kingdom of Aksum, we mentioned, that was a Christian empire. Nubia was a Christian empire, although, it collapsed around 1500. It was a Christian empire, finally was force converted to something else by Islamic imperialism from the north. You also have Kingdom of Congo, which I'll defer to you, the Empire of Zimbabwe, and there was a major West African empire of Songhai with Timbuktu. Those records need to be preserved. I mean, a lot of those are there are really good records there. Now that one was a largely Islamic empire. There were a number of just a lot of them. You want to say anything about the Kingdom of Congo?
Well, I don't know, maybe to point the fact that both Congos used to be part of the same big kingdom. That's why when you see people from the DRC and people from Congo Brazzaville, sometimes we have some of the same languages, but some of the food that we eat, even if there are some variations, it's the same thing. And our physical features are also the same, because back far, we used to be one big kingdom with different small kingdoms in between. But with colonization, all of that got divided and separated. Yeah.
Thank you. Then I've got one last question here, I think. One last question. It says the previous anti-racism movements were very much Christian-driven. Frederick Douglass, MLK, but Black Lives Matter is very much a secular movement. Where do you agree or disagree with this latest third wave of anti-racism?
Go ahead.
It is true. Abolitionist movements historically have normally risen up in Christian cultures because of Christian values. So there were people who were pro-slavery who claimed to be Christian, but there were people who claimed to be pro-slavery in a lot of cultures. But the anti-slavery movement was really based on the spirit of the Bible, I think with a sounder hermeneutic, looking for biblical principles to be recontextualized in a new setting. And so William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, and then it became a dominant feature of evangelicalism in the 1790s, especially British evangelicalism, 1830s, just huge feature of the evangelical revivals in the US. But again, major abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman is one of my favorites, Sojourner Truth. They were all part of the African Methodist tradition, AME or AME Zion. And then the civil rights movement was mainly led by the Black church. But the values that were inculcated, they came from Christianity society can move away from Christianity and still hold on to values for like a generation or two. I'm a little concerned about some of the societies that moved away from the Christian heritage, because ultimately when they start asking what's the basis for our new values, they may, some of those values may slip away. But in any case, I think that the thrust of the movement, Black Lives Matter, all of us agree Black Lives Matter. Our daughter helped organize a protest march here in which we participated. It was a nonviolent protest march. But as to certain features of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think they made some alliances that maybe the Black church as a whole may not have approved of those alliances. But that doesn't negate, I think, the value of the good things in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, in the march that we had, it was a silent march, and we did not put it on Facebook so that it will not spread and become something different. The core value of Black Lives Matter is important. But then the Christian values of what started it in the beginning with all the civil rights movement and so on is important to us. But the other things, we don't want that. So that's why our march, for example, was a silent one, started with prayer, ended with prayer, and a sign to say that, yes, Black Lives Matter, and we are standing with our brothers and sisters for that.
In the around 1990, probably 1991, when Rodney King's beating by the police was caught on tape, and I'm not saying all police are like this, but certainly they were in Rodney King's case and in many cases that have been caught on tape. But we know police officers that are are trying to protect people. So, but I participated in the march. It wasn't a Christian march specifically. There wasn't a Christian march going on at that point, specifically in the city in which I lived. So I participated in a regular march. Now, if violence had started, which isn't characteristic of most of the marches, but in some, and often the violence is provoked by somebody else or by certain rowdy people. But if the violence had happened, I would not have inflicted violence, but I would have suffered it and counted it as suffering for justice and suffering for Christ in that way. So if something is just, we need to participate in it to the extent that it's doing good. If something in it is bad, well, then we don't participate in that part of it. I guess that's my thinking. We back in the when Nadine was an exchange student at Duke, I gave her a T-shirt.
The Free South Africa T-shirt.
Free South Africa T-shirt, anti-apartheid T-shirt. Of course, that didn't require anything of us except paying for a T-shirt. In your country, it was, we know people who protested it there and got in a lot of trouble. Yeah. So.
Sorry, I know I said that was the last question, but I have one more here from Johann Erasmus. And he says, what is your system for finding a book in your office?
Sometimes I can't, actually. But I have some of it canonically, in terms of my New Testament studies. But I ran out of space, so some things are just in piles and piles on the floor. I don't have enough space for them all.
Yeah. And I would not take books in the bedroom, so they have to stay here.
Most of my data is in my research.
Well, I really want to thank you so much, both for taking the time to talk with us tonight, and I know these are these are not easy issues, and but I think it's so important that we need to engage with them. We need to really talk about these things so that we can have true reconciliation. And I really liked what you said about us being in God's image, and we need to focus more on that than on our skin color and those kind of differences. And I don't know if you have any closing comments for us before we sign off.
Well, I would just say that, God who created the rainbows with all the beautiful different colors that are there, he knew that color is important. And if it is important to him, it is important to us. Here in the US, I discovered that somebody who is colorblind has a condition. So let's embrace one another. Let's not be called that we have a condition, but instead living like Jesus lived, love one another, embrace one another, listen to one another, and go the extra mile.
Yeah. It doesn't mean being the same.
Yes.
It means being united, being one, and celebrating some of the differences. Obviously, sin is bad, and every culture has sin, but every culture also has gifts from God, and we can learn from one another and share in those gifts and cross boundaries. The gospel demands it. Ethnic reconciliation is worth living for and dying for. And so we need to cross those boundaries in friendships and in commitments to serve one another, to listen to one another, to let others lead, and us be willing to follow, as well as us being willing to lead when we need to lead. Working together, because we have one leader ultimately that we want to follow.
Amen. Well, again, thank you very much, and may God bless you both, and may He continue to work through you as you seek to glorify Him. So, thank you very much for your time this evening. I just want to say to our listeners, thank you for listening. Thank you for all the comments and the questions. And please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also look at our website, www.rashachristi.co.za. There's some great resources on there, great articles that have been written, and all sorts of things that you can find on there. And then Rasha Christi is a non-profit organization, people's donations. So if you feel led to give, please visit the website and you can click the donate button. But until next week, have a good evening.
Thanks. Amen.
Cool. Are we out? Are we off live?